Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sydney Smith, and I'm the director of the Institute for Humanities, and I'm here to do a welcome for this wonderful event this afternoon with Wendy Chun. This event is brought to you by the Digital Environments Cluster faculty, by the graduate students of the Digital Environments Workshop, and by the Institute for the Humanities. At the Institute for the Humanities, we are able to make our contribution because of a generous endowment that we have. This is the Marc and Constance Jacobson lecture, and I just want to say a couple words about them. They established a gift that endowed this lectureship and that has brought distinguished scholars to the campus and to speak with faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students while they're in residence here. So it's been wonderful to have Wendy here. She's been talking broadly with undergraduates and graduate students and faculty, and I appreciate that. The Jacobsons have also endowed fellowship support for graduate students to work at the Institute for the Humanities. So they've been very generous with their gifts. Mr. Jacobson was an undergraduate here, graduated in 1955, and in 1989 they endowed this lectureship. So that's my welcome. Has everybody got a seat? Come on in. We'll have a reception afterwards. We've got space up in front if people who are on the floor want to come up in front. And now I'm going to turn this over to my friend and colleague in the English department, Wei Wei, who's going to do the real introduction. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Sid. Thanks to the Institute for the Humanities for co-sponsoring this event. Thanks especially to the staff at Doritha for making this happen. I'd also like to thank and recognize Dimitri and Candace over there, who are the co-coordinators of the Digital Environments Workshop. They've done some truly remarkable work in organizing both grad students and faculty across a range of departments. They're putting together a round of other events as well. We'd also like to announce, for instance, that next month, from March 19th and 20th, Carolyn Kane, who is an assistant professor of film and media at Hunter College, will be talking about a work in progress, chromatic algorithms, synthetic color, computer art, and aesthetics after code. Please stay tuned for more details. If you have any questions, if you'd like to join in some of the events that the Digital Environments Workshop is doing, please see Candace or Dimitri over there. All right. On to today's speaker, Wendy Chun, who is professor of modern culture and media at Brown University. I first met Wendy at a lecture hall, much like this one, as she was demonstrating her computer's promiscuous mode. For those of you who don't know, promiscuous mode is a setting your computer can activate to eavesdrop, or in technical jargon, to sniff other computers that are in the immediate network. So you can imagine what happened in the lecture hall after Wendy activated promiscuous mode. All of a sudden, we began to fidget in our seats, worried that our web transactions might show up on Wendy's projector and therefore visible for all to see. We were uncomfortable about this weird intimacy we now had with each other's data, which we thought was private. And that discomfort, you can see that even from the awkwardness of this phrase I'm about to say, because literally Wendy's computer was sniffing my computer. And yet the vulnerability that Wendy had shown in the lecture was also paradoxically a good or at least interesting thing, right? For those of us sitting in the lecture hall, it made us look up from our seats and around at each other. It reconfigured our relationship with each other. It brought us into a sort of paradoxical kind of community. As she writes in her book, Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics, the fact that using makes us vulnerable does not condemn the internet, for what form of agency does not require risk? It is another form of risk, actually, that I want to speak about today, intellectual risk. That's the thing I most admire about Wendy's work. She's trained in both English literature and also systems design engineering, generating a corpus of work that is informed by technology, but also theory. And while we might want to force a kind of interdisciplinary upon this by saying that what she does is the intersection of engineering and cultural studies, I think she does something much more. She does something more than just that intersection. As an example, her latest book, Program Vision, Software and Memory, explores software as a thing, often hidden beneath opaque interfaces, and thus questioning what is knowable. It forces us to think about computers, code, and software as more than just machinic instances of technology. They're all imbued with social, political, and economic relationships. Technology, therefore, is not just technology, but an articulation of power. It's a system that has racial and sexual implications. Her talk today, Imagine Networks, Affective Connections, interrogates what it means to be a network, steering away from the material telecommunications structure of a network. She addresses the imaginative and affective relationships that give networks definitions beyond just zeros and ones, or in her words, creating intriguing new crises and social formations. We're really lucky and happy to have her today. Please join me in giving Wendy a warm welcome to the University of Michigan. Thanks.
Thank you, Wei, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for having me. I've already had such a wonderful visit. I've been here for a while and met with so many people that it's such a pleasure to be here and to be able to share my work with you today. So before I begin, let me warn you, as Wei has said, I'm going to go through some parts of the book that I'm currently writing. Let me warn you, though, that because I want to give you a sense of the questions and problems driving this current work, that I'll talk quickly. I'll show you far more than I'll read. My argument will appear schematically rather than just orally, so that by the end you all might feel a little dizzy. But this, I promise, is part of the argument. But just in case you get lost, I want to start with a brief clip that gets at some of the questions driving this project, and it's the beginning of Coney, which I'm sure most of you have already seen.
Right now, there are more people on Facebook than there were on the planet 200 years ago. Humanity's greatest desire is to belong and connect. And now we see each other. We hear each other.
Grandpa, I love you. I love you.
Why want to take a picture?
We share what we love, and it reminds us what we all have in common.
I got alive and well after 7.5 days.
If you believe in yourself, you will know how to ride a bike. Rock and roll.
So now technically your device is on. Can you tell? Oh, that's exciting.
And this connection is changing the way the world works. Governments are trying to keep up.
No, we got this the freedom.
And older generations are concerned.
Many people are very concerned about tomorrow because they could get worse next year.
The game has new rules. The next 27 minutes are an experiment. But in order for it to work, you have to pay attention.
Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, this video was fantastically popular. It had 94 million views on YouTube. It was also roundly critiqued, and it was roundly critiqued for many obvious reasons, such as the fact that it has almost nothing to do with Uganda, right? It's about the capture of Coney, allegedly, but if Coney 2012 was about anything, it was this sort of banal and blatant celebration of social networking sites. In fact, it imagined the imagined capture of Coney as proof that social networking sites work, right? And it also imagines the world as a network, right? Driven by allegedly common desire for connection. But what's really interesting about this alleged common desire for connection is that it's also framed as a desire for the filmmaker to contact you. And that's made very clear in this clip.
I made that promise to Jacob, not knowing what it would mean. but now I do. Over the past 9 years, I have fought to fulfill it, and the fight has led me here, to this movie you're watching. Because that promise is not just about Jacob or me, it's also about you. And this year, 2012, is the year that we can finally fulfill it. And if we succeed, we change the course of human history. But time is running out.
Right, so the you here, importantly, is imagined as both singular and plural. And that's what's unique about you. You is both singular and plural, but in its plural mode, it still targets individuals as individuals, right? So it's an imagined rhetorical relation. It's an apostrophe with all that literary rhetorical baggage around the apostrophe that animates and suspends you who are watching this. And it also demands that you respond to a crisis. Importantly, it's framed as Coney 2012. It has to be resolved within a calendar year. Now, Coney has also been critiqued as a form of slacktivism, right? So it's been critiqued as reducing humanitarianism to this, right? To contacting these famous people who will then make things happen, right? This critique, of course, elides the question, what form of humanitarianism isn't a form of slacktivism, right? What's the real difference between giving 5 cents a day to save the children or clicking or emailing these kids? So in other words, something about humanitarianism and affective connection and networks seem to be aligned. Now, this critique of Coney as slacktivism also avoids the question, what networks aren't banal? What networks aren't banal? And to what extent does the power of networks actually stem from their banality, right? From the ways in which they eviscerate details in order to animate, in order to make possible groups of yous, right? Even further, this critique ignores what's arguably most intriguing about Coney 2012. The fact that it was a 1-month wonder. Those 93 million hits happened in 1 month. And as you'll see here, its demise quickly led to the demise of the creator's sanity. Found here exposed and exposing himself on the streets of La Jolla. And this video was very interesting because it was capped with not to be seen by adolescent girls, right? Who are, of course, the target audience of Coney 2012. And I preface my talk with Coney 2012 because its meteoric rise and fall raises important questions about the ephemeral nature, as well as the dangers and the pleasures of connection, the dangers and pleasures of contact, of ephemeral actions that have rather bizarrely become represented spatially within network theory as lines that persist, of ephemeral actions, relations, friendships that are more dangerous, the more banal they are, of ephemeral actions that generate new and unforeseen formations. Who, after all, would have thought that a South Korean parody, like a parody of South Korean consumption, right, would now have over 531 million hits? And as a side, what I've been realizing more and more as I've been working in the field of new media is that what's most fascinating about new media isn't what's new, right? To call something new is to guarantee that it'll one day be old, right? It's to live on the bleeding edge of obsolescence. What's most fascinating about new media is the ways in which the new is made to linger, the ways in which the new becomes habitual. So structuring, the ways in which it becomes part of us precisely because it's no longer new. So I start with Coney 2012 because it, in the most banal way possible, at once confirms and questions the power of networks, because it reveals that we assume too much if we assume we know what a connection is, because it reveals the gaps between our representation of our networks and our experience of them, because it reveals the gaps between maps which are always too early and too late, right? Maps are either projections or traces, the gap between maps and our constantly broadcast gestures that are only sometimes reciprocated and acknowledged, even as they are imagined always to connect, right? So if you think about it, and this is the example I'll be thinking through at the end of the talk, friendship is broadcast, right? It starts with an act. It starts with an act to like, to love someone who you don't know will like you back or doesn't have to like you back, right? So think of all that drama around Valentine's Day when you're in elementary school, right? Emily got a Valentine's Day card, but she didn't give you one, right? So friendship is traditionally asymmetrical, which is why it's been such a difficult category for sociologists to use. But now it's this, right? A sociologist's dream, a formally symmetrical relation that can be plotted and traced. And this transformation of friendship has been central to a transformation of the internet, to a new imagining of the internet, which I'll unpack later. So part one, imagine networks. For the past decade or so, and as I was telling several people, it's really nice getting old. You can say things like for the past decade or so, or actually I could say past 2 decades. So for the past 2 decades, I've been trying to understand the conceptual and political power of networks. Clearly, to emphasize the importance of networks is hardly profound or new. From Manuel Castells' exhaustive description of network society to Tiziana Terranova's brilliant analysis of network culture, networks have been the subject of much theoretical investigation. Networks themselves have also become prized theoretical tools. From Deleuze and Guattari's discussion of rhizomatic structures to Bruno Latour's call for actor network theory, networks have become central to theory. From high-speed financial networks that erode national sovereignty to Twitter feeds that foster new political alliances, networks allegedly encapsulate the new global formation, the new social institutions, the new forms of global contagion and capitalism. Further, as this passage makes clear, networks both defines these new global formations and also links them all together in one network. Networks, to say the least, though, are strange entities. Modern networks stem from structures built to transport vehicles and electricity, structures deliberately constructed to resemble nets. But networks have moved from planning tools and ideal technical structures to actually existing humanly and inhumanly discovered entities such as these, right? So systems biology infers the existence of networks in animals from the genetic to the multicellular. Ecology similarly conceptualized food webs and less lethal animal interactions as networks. And a growing field within ecology is actually animal social networks. This insistence on networks as actually existing empirical entities happens even as many network scientists will admit, network analysis itself is an abstraction. Network analysis replaces the real thing with a mathematical model. A model that engages selectively with our data-rich world by eviscerating context in most data. So in other words, what I want to get us to do is think through that network map I showed you. What if we thought about that network map as actually cutting the network? So what the network actually is everything that's not represented by those intersections, right? Networks understood in this comic form, the comic form of these intersections that we see, are thus both theoretical diagram and actually existing phenomenon. Indeed, they compromise the distinction between the constructed and the natural, the theoretical and the empirical, the human and the inhuman. To map, in other words, is both to plan and to solve, to describe and prescribe, right? So the point, in other words, if you think of Google Maps, the point is to follow Google Maps. Further, network analysis depends on networks. Networks are not only useful, in other words, to diagnose contagion, networks are themselves contagious. As Watts argues, in order for the new science of networks to succeed, the science of networks must become a manifestation of its own subject matter, a network of scientists collectively solving problems that cannot be solved by any single individual or any single discipline. So networks make porous the boundaries between the many disciplines that employ networks, from economics to media studies, from political science to biology. Every discipline, that is, seems to have found networks, and by finding networks, have found each other, right? And this new universal construct. It takes a network to analyze networks. Networks generate networks. Further, and this is really odd if you think about it, the success of networks is often measured by their spread, right? So the end goal, the measure of success of many socially conscious networks, such as Teach for America, is not the eradication of the problem, not the eradication of poverty or injustice, but the spread of networks, right? So here you see Teach for America's assessment of its long-term impact, right? This makes no sense. The success of socially conscious networks should be their demise, not their spread. And it should be about the success of the students rather than the teachers, right? Now, in a similar vein to Watts, albeit with a very different purpose and methodology, Bruno Latour has argued that in order to perform actor-network theory, one must become an ant, right? A blind, myopic, workaholic, trail-sniffing, collective traveler. There then seems to be no end to networks, right? And to their analyses, only more webs to be spun and spun into each other. To open up this web and to make it's the network the beginning rather than the end of the story. And it's remarkable that we think it's a network in any way answers questions rather than begins questions, right? I've been thinking of networks increasingly as imagined. To be clear, by focusing on networks as imagined, I'm not saying that they're fanciful objects that don't exist. So I'm not saying that quorum sensing doesn't happen or that autoinducers or pheromones don't act like signaling molecules. But I am arguing that the force of networks stems in part from how they figure connections and flows that link and breach, the personal and the social, the political and the technological, the biological and the machinic. The power of networks stems in parts from how they spatialize the temporal by giving us a way to produce an image, a trace of the myriad interactions around us. The explanatory power of networks, that is, stems from how they figure connection, from how they reduce interactions and agents to independent nodes and edges. A reduction, again, think of the network as everything that's not traced as opposed to the trace, right? A reduction of ephemeral contacts that fade and generate and strengthen with time. Contacts that generate agents into things that are stable and spatial. A reduction that even as it seeks to elucidate, and I want to stress that my critique is a very sympathetic one to networks. So a reduction that even as it seeks to elucidate events, and in particular catastrophic and cascading events, even as it tries to elucidate these catastrophic and cascading events, can only poorly represent them as this, because events call into question the very separation of node from edge, from node to node, because contact, as Sarah Ahmed has argued, is generative. So in other words, contact generates these things which can only later be represented as nodes and connections. Now, in calling them imagined, I'm also drawing from Benedict Anderson's influential and controversial assertion that nations are imagined political communities. And I'd be happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. I'm not, however, just gesturing towards Anderson. I'm also gesturing towards the ways in which networks are so powerful in part because they allow us to trace, if not imagine, the unimaginable. They allow us to trace the unimaginable world of global capital, of global climate change, etc., even as they participate in, even as they make even worse, and indeed even create unimaginable and unforeseeable futures and presents. That is, they've been so compelling in part, and let me just show you visually what they do. And this is that move of the zoom, right? They have become so compelling partly because they've been key to dispelling postmodern confusion, replacing the pastiche with the zoom and the overview, to enabling a form of resolution that moves fluidly across allegedly dissonant scales, right? From the molar to the molecular, from the individuating to the generic, very much that move. And what's interesting about this, what it also realizes, of course, what you have is a zoom and an overview over a pastiche that's replicated over and over and over again. Okay, so part 2, mapping the unmappable. So networks, even as they engender ever more connections and unpredictable events, have been key to ending postmodern confusion and to establishing an era of neoliberal empowerment. It's the network that is, as an answer, responds to, resolves postmodern confusion and pastiche. To make this point, let me turn to Fred Jameson's influential diagnosis of postmodernism. So Fred, in the mid-1980s, argued that since the 19th century, since the era of industrial and imperial capitalism, it's become harder and harder to conceive of our position in the world. This is because increasingly the truth of our seemingly authentic experiences lies elsewhere. So the truth of the 19th century domestic English life, which is tea, lay in India. This discontinuity between the authentic and the true, Jameson contends, is amplified in the era of postmodernity. In the era of postmodernity, cities and all spaces are more unmappable because this new postmodern space suppresses distance, it saturates voids, right? It exposes the body to perpetual barrages of immediacy from which all sheltering layers and intervening mediations have been removed. And this saturation of space, Jameson argues, leads to a new and historically original dilemma, in which we're inserted as individual subjects into a multidimensional set of radically discontinuous realities, whose frame of reference range from the still surviving spaces of bourgeois private life all the way to the unimaginable decentering of global capital itself. And this decentering, this historically new dilemma, makes it impossible for us, he argues, to cognitively map our relations to totality, to realize our place within the late capitalist system. Now, this conception of individual subjects is caught in an overwhelming, unrepresentable, unimaginable global system was eerily echoed across disciplines in this time period, from sociology to economics, from ecology to physics. So to give you another example, Ulrich Beck, writing in 1986 and analyzing the emergence of what he called a risk society, similarly contended, intentionally or not, through accident or catastrophes in war or peace, a large group of the population faces devastation and destruction today for which language and the powers of our imagination fail us, for which we lack any moral or medical category. We are concerned with the absolute and unlimited not, which threatens us here, the un in general, unimaginable, unthinkable, un. In a less apocalyptic and therefore less utopian manner, Marc Granovetter, writing in 1973, also argued that the personal experience of individuals is closely bound up with larger scale aspects of social structure well beyond the purview or control of particular individuals. So to understand the relationship between personal experience and larger systems, he produced one of the first social maps, which you're seeing here, which revealed the importance of weak ties. So for both Jacobson and Granovetter, maps and mapping were key to resolving this dilemma. To resolve our postmodern disorientation, Jacobson called for a not yet imagined form of art, a political socialist art of cognitive mapping that would enable us to regain our ability to act. So this assumes, of course, the project of cognitive mapping assumes that cognition is central to agency, right? That we can't act effectively as political agents unless we know. Right? Unless we know the big picture, unless we can authenticate our experiences, unless we can map where we are. Right? Acts of mapping were to enable us to trace, if not to represent, the movement of seemingly unseeable entities, to imagine the unimaginable. From affects, and what I find really interesting about affect theory is even as it insists on affect as something unimaginable, the language that used to talk about it in terms of intensity and transmission is very much the language of networks, right? From affects to capital, from environmental toxins to global climate change. This promise of mapping cuts across very different understandings of what maps were to do, right? So to give you an opposite example from Jacobson and Granovetter, if for them networks were key to reconnecting the micro to the macro, the societal to the individual, for others, most influentially, Deleuze and Guattari, the promise of maps stemmed from the ways in which they frustrated moves towards the transcendental and totalizing. So taking up the figure of the rhizome, an immanent structure that emphasizes connection, heterogeneity, and multiplicity, they argued that the rhizome is a map, not a tracing, where a map fosters connections between fields. It's open and connectable in all of its dimensions. It can be torn, reversed, adapted to any kind of mounting, reworked by an individual group or social formation. The map has to do with performance. Perhaps. But we now seem to be in a new and perhaps historically unique situation. We seem always to be forever mapping, forever performing, forever empowered, but no less able to foresee and intervene decisively into the world around us. Mapping, that is, seems to follow network logic, to further it rather than resolve it. And think again of the zoom offered by Koenig, which is a pastiche offered over and over again. That is, we can move from the zoom to the overview, the detail to the point, but we seem still always to be moving and never changing, right? Even worse, we've become so dependent on our mapping technologies that we seem incapable of acting without them. Think of the trust that we have in Google Maps, right? I'm astounded constantly by the authority that we give them. Even though we know their satellite images are 5 years old, even though we know their images don't really offer us a current street view, right? We still trust them. We still follow them, even though we know they're wrong. And I do this all the time, even driving home. I'm like, Google Maps tells me to take this exit. Surely maybe for the past 10 years I haven't known of this shortcut, right? In other words, so if Beck makes a really interesting argument that secondhand non-experience is now what determines personal experience, and there's a disconnect, there's a way in which secondhand non-experience becomes the first thing that's referred to precisely through these network representations. To return to Jacobson, if there exists a disconnect between the authentic personal experience and the truth of the experience, we now seem automatically to trust a systematic representation before personal experience. These sites, that is, or a different way to understand this, is that these sites have taken the place of theory, right? So theory stems from the Greek term theoria, a group of officials who witness an event. And once a theoria witnessed an event, the event was recognized as actually happening. For many, it seems now that an event doesn't happen unless it's been uploaded, liked, and shared. That reality increasingly is a place to take pictures to upload to Facebook, right? That the territory has become the map, an inversion of Baudrillard's formulation. So to be increasingly is arguably to be updated, the object of and subject to updates. And this constant updating reveals the extent to which connections are temporal and potential. Connections are always temporal and potential, and their permanency is an effect of repetition and of habit, right? So what's really unique and interesting about social networking sites is the ways in which it's automated those gestures necessary for maintaining something that seems as permanent as friendship. To return to our perhaps unique historical situation, the performance of desire and the move to deterritorialize, as Bifo Berardi has argued, has become the basis of neoliberal capitalism. Desire is a field, not an escape. So most pointedly, my question is this. What difference is there between neoliberal discourses of empowerment and these calls for resistance? To what extent does the very act and notion of cognitive mapping, with its emphasis on the cognitive, the subject that knows, and on mapping, the tracing of links, to what extent does this call for cognitive mapping forestall change? Forestall change by rendering what's temporal spatial, right? By constructing subjects as independent and interchangeable nodes, by apostrophizing yous, by making reality conform to its map. And to make this point and to get at the political stakes of imagined networks, consider, for instance, how our imagining of the internet has changed over the past couple of decades. So over the past couple of decades, we've witnessed a drastic change in how the internet is imagined. We've moved from this, right, the early internet, in which freedom stemmed from anonymity, from no one knowing you're a dog, right? So the internet was a free space because our bodies and minds could finally be severed, and thus our authentic inner selves could be revealed. And as I point out in my first book, this is a really strange understanding of the internet, right? If you consider the promiscuous exchange of information that drives the internet, if you consider the fact that the internet is a control protocol, why did we ever view it as this space of freedom? But we've moved from this virtual understanding of the internet to this, right? An equally strange notion of the internet as a semi-private space of true names and true images, right? The internet as augmenting reality. And in this semi-private space, freedom stems from knowing who's a dog and who isn't, right? So the authentic, in other words, increasingly stems from positively authenticating, from what I'm calling use value. Now, crucially, this move, which has been central to the formation of the internet itself as a market, has been presented as a way to form trust, has been presented as a way to protect our children from stranger danger, to buttress the walls of the home, to buttress the barrier between the intimate and the public that the internet has allegedly compromised, right? So a lot of corporations, especially social networking sites, will say we need authentication in order to keep our children safe, right? Paradoxically, however, this move to protect the home, this move to protect the boundary between the intimate and public, and indeed this attempt to protect our children from pornography has led to the opposite. Or to be more precise, this vision has been realized, this sort of 1994 cyber porn, the internet, has been realized, but in terms very different than initially conceived. So now with the spread of social networking sites, with the spread of cell phones, we're witnessing an explosion in, a crowd-sourced explosion in child pornography, right? But creepy old men aren't creating it for other creepy old men, but rather children are producing it for each other. And sexting generates a lot more than ugly high school drama, right? It leads to serious incarceration. Because of laws put in place during this time to protect our children from online predators, minors who engage in sexting are now sex offenders. So a few years ago in Florida, a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old took a picture of themselves having sex and emailed it to themselves. Now in Florida, it's legal for them to have sex, it's legal for them to get married, but it's illegal for them to email that image, right? And as a consequence, they who can't be named because they're minors, I can't say who they are, they're protected because they're minors, they for the rest of their lives have to register as sex offenders. So let me state this as boldly as possible. Attempts to make the network seem safe, attempts to make the network seem more intimate, put us at greatest risk. Attempts to cover over the constant promiscuous exchange of information that is the network make us more vulnerable precisely because we somehow feel safer. Indeed, if anything has compromised that boundary between the intimate and the open, it's the banal notion of friendship fostered by so many social networking sites. Think of the recent explosion in cyberbullying and harassment. Think of all the Facebook disasters out there. These all stem from structures of trust and authentication. Given this situation, given that authentication has not led to safety, we need to ask ourselves, what exactly does this structure of friendship do? And to respond to this question, let's return for a moment. For some, a return, for some, a first time. I mentioned Friendster earlier, and everyone was like, Friendster? Okay, so let us return to that site that first popularized the notion of friend, Friendster.com. Right? So Friendster.com took as its business plan Milgram's notion that we're all within 6 degrees of separation of each other. And as you recall, it showed us an image you could see within 4 degrees of your friends. Right? And Friendster was initially conceived as a dating site. Right? So in other words, to compete with those algorithms by Match and eHarmony, it crowdsourced recommendations. But to work, it had to, unlike something like eHarmony and Match, it had to expand its base beyond people actively looking, right? So people would go there and recommend and say, these are my friends, in order to create connections. So the site, in other words, exploited the muddy boundary between those looking open and those taken or closed, while seeming to respect this boundary by asking people to explicitly state what their relationship status was. Now, as Dana Boyd has argued, Friendster died in part due to the Fakester genocide, in which popular fake profiles were taken down, such as Jesus Christ. Right? So these were taken down in order to ensure the site's accuracy and therefore its trustability. They were also taken down, though, because these Fakester sites actually were making Friendster's server grind to a halt. Right? If it goes through 4 degrees of separation, but everyone's linked to a Fakester, suddenly the map that has to be generated is really computationally intense. Right? This purge of Fakesters, though, this purge of Fakesters in order to make everyone feel like the information was real and this was actually working, had the opposite effect. Right? So after the Fakester genocide, most people left the site. Regardless of its demise as a dating site, it's now really popular in East Asia as a gaming site. Friendster.com's legacy is this bizarre notion of friendship, which assumes that friendship is reciprocal and verifiable. That is a matter of mutual agreement. And as Boyd notes, this impoverished notion of friendship, which reduces friendship to a binary yes-no relation, created all sorts of dilemmas, right? So all of a sudden, your mother and your boss all knew what you were doing. However, these boundary crossings and their attendant consequences, rather than being an unfortunate side effect of Friendster, were the point. It's how it worked. As Boyd herself notes, the purpose of Friendster was to confuse the separation. right? So it deliberately confused the boundaries between public and private. It depended on the public exhibition of private relationships in order to allow for more private interactions, right? And this stretching of the logic of friend was also key to its business model, right? So to provide the best form of authentication and the most variety, it had to move beyond the normal aegis of friends. Now, this act of confusing these boundaries and its creation of a new voluntary and involuntary bonds has transformed the internet into a series of poorly gated communities, the transformation of the internet into a market itself. So part 3, the friend of my friend is my enemy. So how is value generated online? However disappointing and deferred, why was Facebook.com's IPO worth so much? At one level, it seems simple. Information is now a commodity. This is Castells' argument. This is many people's argument. Information is crucial to making the right, that is, the most profitable decisions. And Goldman Sachs, therefore, is willing to pay millions of dollars for a computer program that can make the right decision milliseconds before another company. The value of information now, though, doesn't simply coincide with its newness or its discovery. So if in the past, as Benjamin has argued, the value of information coincided with its newness, now newness alone does not determine value, right? So currently many news organizations charge for old information, right? So you can get this week's version of This American Life for free, but you have to pay for its archive. Right? So we pay for information we miss, if we do, either because we want to see it again, or because we missed it the first time, and we want it because our missing has been registered by all these other references to it. Right? So consider in this light all those YouTube videos that referenced Two Girls, One Cup after that video had been taken down, right? So people knew of the existence of that video precisely because you saw videos of people watching that video, right? So repetition, in other words, produces value. Repeated references and likes by friends and strangers mark something as valuable, as worth visiting, as worth downloading. Information, some event, some media object becomes valuable when it moves from a singularly noted event, actually from what's new, to something that elicits mass response. Right? This is why sociological analyses of things like Twitter focus on retweets. Right? And there's a reason why liking and retweeting is so easy. It's a form of clean data. Right? So in other words, it's not new media, it's arguably renewed media. Right? And it's that renewal from which value emerges. So as this repetition makes clear, value is not generated by you, but rather a plethora of yous, right? By the very interconnection between the various yous. And so this is why even after, if you use the New York Times site and you've gone over your 20 free views, you can still see articles if you link to it from elsewhere, a referring site or from a search engine, because it's that reference they want. That reference is what's valuable, right? So you is central to the operation of networks because it's both singular and plural. But in its plural form, it still refers to individuals as individuals rather than a communal subject, a we. You're not a we, you're still a you even when you're plural. In a network, nodes are still theoretically distinct, however aggregated. And of course, social media emphasizes you, YouTube. You are the person of the year. Now, to talk about the collective nature of network value is hardly new. Yochai Benkler, for instance, has offered an extensive theory of peer-to-peer production in Wealth of Networks. You can also think of Pierre Lévy's notion of collective intelligence and also Paulo Verno's notion of general intellect. Yes, but I want to think through collective value slightly differently. For what counts as value is not simply our voluntary interactions, right? The information we need to act. It's not simply crowdsourcing, but rather traces of our involuntary movement. The richness of network data, our data-rich environment, comes from tracing and storing our every action and then linking it to others so we can build affiliation networks. That is, if our world is now data-rich, it's not simply because we're all providing information for free, but because our every interaction is made to leave a trace. We're talking about a politics of storage and deletion here, which is then incorporated and used to further understand you, where you is always plural and singular. Right? So Facebook.com, Amazon.com, and Google, amongst other sites, mine our data not simply to identify you as a unique user. That's really simple to do. I mean, no one Googles your name more than you do. It's really easy to link your IP address to you, right? But also, and more importantly, for how our likes coincide with others. They analyze and collect data, that is, in ways that suspend the difference between the individual and statistical body, even as they respect and insist on this difference by providing us with individual logins and pages optimized for us. So if once, as Alan Sekula influentially argued in relation to the production of photographic evidence, the body and the archive were related through two different systems of description, one focused on identifying the individual, right? So that's the Bertillon system. And the other centered on identifying the hidden type driving the body, so embedding the archive in the photograph. These two processes have now become inseparable. The same process captures the data necessary to identify individuals as singular and to identify their relation to certain groups. So Amazon.com is so powerful because it tracks individual purchases, not just to create a record of us. A record of one alone is not valuable, but also so it connects to actions with others in order to make suggestions for further purchases. That is, so it can predict and encourage future behavior that conforms to and that confirms and optimizes statistical network analyses. But this only works if we're authenticated online, right? Only if we're trusted to be telling the truth, right? If we've bought into that one login, one person structure, or we become enmeshed within an authenticating structure by our so-called friends who authenticate us for us, right? Another way to understand the importance of yous is through the relationship between you are hailed, and ideology. And Althusser, of course, argued that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to the real conditions of existence. So, in other words, his famous example is that ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. So the policeman yells out, "Hey, you," and the person automatically turns around and recognizes himself as subject. Now, it's crucial that the person hailed recognizes herself as hailed, and that such hailings rarely miss their mark. Now, Althusser's notion of ideology is controversial and has gone through a number of revisions. And the revision I find most compelling, and that gets me to use rather than you, is Richard Dienst. So Dienst, thinking through the way television hails us, argues that if ideology can miss its mark, then ideology must have been unstable as a sign and event. So ideology, in other words, as an event, is a mass of transmissions that neither hails nor nails its subject in place. And he goes on to argue that if it neither hails nor nails its subject in place, that this, rather than taking away from the power of ideology, actually grounds it. So rather than always connecting, ideology never does. So subjects always look on to these messages as if eavesdropping, as if peeking at someone else's mail. So as he puts it in a formula, ideology requires a short circuit between the singular and the general so that the reception of a representation becomes a sending back, a representation of a reception. Now, although Dienst develops his theory in relationship to broadcast television, this description of ideology as a short circuit between the singular and the general through a sending back also describes use value, right? So in a network, our captured actions involuntarily send back, if you think back of promiscuous mode, a representation of reception. And in this sense, there's no silence of the masses, right? New media interactivity thrives on this constant and involuntary exchange of information. This technological closing, though, is complemented by another, right? So through acts of friending, following, liking, recommending, we register these receptions and also are registered by others, right? So through these gestures of liking, sharing, etc., messages become more and more directed and less general, better targeted, because we answer our friends' eavesdropped calls, right? Especially if we care for them. Through the act of friending, through the act of circulating things with our friends, of liking things, we enmesh them more tightly into the network and their underbelly. So the point I'm making is not only does friending turn broadcast networks into traceable networks, it also transforms friendship, which is itself a broadcast phenomenon. Again, it starts by you liking someone with no guarantee of reciprocity, into nodal reciprocal networks. Okay, but I also want to stress that these acts of friendship also overwhelm and compromise these networks as well. Most particularly because friends and the division between friends and enemies is never clear, right? One's greatest enemy is often one's greatest friend, right? And second, because they threaten to overwhelm the network by spreading viruses in spam. That is, through the care we show for others, we keep messages, we keep spam, we keep viruses alive. So think of spam, right? Spam is most effective when it's received from a friend, right? You're most likely to wire that money to your friend in Spain, precisely because of a relationship in place. To be clear, though, I don't want to simply condemn this desire for intimacy and its dangers, for perhaps this desire for intimacy and danger is what's most wonderful about the internet as well. So let me conclude with a little story. Recently, I fell victim to a phishing attack. To say I fell victim is actually a little misleading. As soon as I clicked on it, I knew that something was wrong. Now, had I not been babysitting 2 small children at the time, any people procreators? 2 hours with 2 small children, I was ready to extend my member and send many to Nigeria. And had I not been using my iPhone, which is a horrible display, right? So it's really hard to tell the URL, I would never have made that mistake. But this phishing attack was brilliant, and in fact is the most effective phishing attack on Twitter. This private message was sent to me by Fiona Barnett, who runs Haystack Scholars, so the context was perfect. Right? She's a former undergraduate. In fact, she was one of my first undergrads. Of course she would care. Right? So this phishing attack led everyone who was following me on Twitter to be phished in turn. So this phishing attack outed me as being naive and possibly paranoid, right? I had also just returned from a conference, right? So predictably, many folk contacted me directly to let me know what I had already known, that I had been phished. And so one of my 27 only tweets is telling everyone who was following me on Twitter that that private message I sent them was anything but, and it was a phishing attack. This made me realize that I'd been taking the wrong approach to social networking, and that from now on, I was only going to friend and follow people I hated. There was, however, a surprising upside to this story that made me decide not to do this. Given the fact that I hardly ever tweet, this phishing attack gave me an opportunity to reach out to everyone who, for some bizarre reason, felt like they might want to hear a 140-character tweet that I might sometime compose in the future. It allowed me to reach out to everyone and say, I love you. And one particular exchange made this point to me. So a close colleague of mine had received the phishing message from me. I think you know her. And she said that she was honored to do so. Right? And Lily Irani, a brilliant graduate student I had met that summer, posted this in response. And in response, I posted this. Although I was half joking at the time, there's something to spam as love. Right? This exchange actually led to both of us talking about the relevance of Beth Povinelli's work and about the relationship between virtual and actual source that are always somehow linked to emerging nations. And this loving side of spam should make us rethink the difference between spam and not spam. Like, what's the difference between this spam and those semi-automatic happy birthday Facebook postings that we get, right? Posted by machines reminding us to act like machines and say happy birthday, right? So involuntary, or not entirely voluntary messages from others, though, remind us. They remind us that we're somehow connected to them, that we're in their address book, that they care enough about us to put us at risk. As the founder of Slashdot noted, slashing something, liking something, also means taking it down, right? And what's really interesting to me is that moments of community, moments of we, are moments in which networks go down. Community is interestingly a network weapon. These interactions remind us that freedom and friendship are experiences that deny subjectivity as much as they make it possible. Yes, friendship can be reduced to a reciprocal relation. Yes, friendship can be reciprocal, but friendship, as Derrida has argued, is fundamentally unreciprocal. As Jean-Luc Nancy has argued, freedom, which is etymologically linked to friend, is an experience. It's an attempt executed without reserve, given over to the peril of its own lack of foundation and security in this object of which it is not the subject, but instead the passion, exposed like the pirate who freely tries his luck on the high seas. The root for pirate is also the root for peril and experience. And this kind of freedom, this kind of friendship comes without guarantees. Freedom is not something we possess, not something that someone could own or give to another. It's a force that both breaks bonds and makes bonds possible. Friendship as an experience is both a moment of terror and of hope, a moment of hosting without meaning to or intending to, of being hostage to the other, a moment and an experience of, as Tom Keenan has argued, of being human in the most non-human way, of having to act and respond without knowing how. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions. Were there lots of cookies? Okay, sorry. Sorry, I can't. Hello.
Hola.
Hola. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. It's lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. So at the beginning, I missed the beginning, but there was a sense that networks, at least via Jameson and cognitive mapping, alluded to notions of allegory and notions of the sublime, at least in this un. And in reading Galloway and Interface Effect, he certainly attaches himself to allegory as a way to read the interface and control. And so to the degree that you remap and reperform now under neoliberal space, and I think this element of removing oneself, no longer transparent or translucent but opaque, is there a sense in which your imagined space is moving towards a kind of an incommensurable network that participates in whether you call it spam ontology or some other sort of process, is that the inhuman, incommensurable network that you are pushing toward is a way to route or escape the very kind of condition or network of ontology? I mean, or is there no escape?
That's a great question. And one way I would like to think through it is precisely through thinking of the difference between the map and something like connection. Because one thing that the network as allegory does is to actually take modes of contact and render them into these bizarre sort of tracings, right? So therefore, taking these constant interactions which are necessary for, and generative, and rendering them into something that seems to be emitting from nodes and connections, right? So one thing I'm trying to do, again, is to think through the network as, or what's important is everything that's not represented within that network map, right? So it's to try to inhabit the gaps, rather, and see what happens when we think through those, right? And part of the reason why I'm doing this and thinking through this is not necessarily because I'm against networking or networks, but rather because what's fascinating about network science is that it tries to understand what it can't represent spatially, right? Those events that catastrophically change everything. So part of that is trying to think through the question of the ephemeral. But the other thing that I'm trying to think of and why the gap for me is so important is something like global climate change, right? The global climate change models are critiqued all the time because they're not accurate, right? But the thing is, if you wait until you know if, and this has already happened, if global climate change models are true, it's too late. So if you believe they're true, you're going to act in such a way that they become unverified. Now, that gap is precisely where action can happen, right? The gap between the prediction and the empirical. So again, trying to think through the sort of space in between as the moment for political action that's opened up is one way I'm trying to engage with this.
I wonder how you might talk about friendship in the context of the Internet of Things and its relationship to the Internet of People. And I don't know whether what that might insert into your analysis or whether it falls outside of it.
No, I think that's a great question. And I think what is also interesting about thinking of the Internet of Things or different forms of action is that, and this is why Bruno Latour goes to active network theory, is because what matters are these actions and agents that aren't simply human.
Yeah.
So to think through the Internet of Things or various sort of interactions between things as themselves significant is intriguing. The question is, what does one understand the links, the likes, the ways in which things become enmeshed through? And there, what's interesting is it's far more of a language of sort of S&M bondage of our machines. They're not friends, they're bonded. So no one else. Maybe too many years in engineering school has sort of, like master and slaves and like. Has anyone spent a lot of time with Unix? Anyway, so I think that there, and again, what's interesting for me about networking and the language of networking too is in terms of sex and sexuality. As I was telling the graduate students, part of it was like a nice girl from Canada in engineering school, and it was one of my first work terms. I was working on. What was I working on? IEEE 10BASE-T converters. It was back in the day when most Ethernet was still thin cable, and so we were working on thin cable to telco converters. And I was soldering away, but also working on all these networks, had this like little local area network around me, and I was like, what are these male to female connectors doing?
Yeah.
And what are these gender benders? And why is everything relentlessly male and female? And I was like, what are my machines doing? So I think that whole question of language and the way they're thought of is really interesting. And what's interesting about friendship in particular is that it reaches the private and the public, right? It's considered to be that concept that's also voluntary, right? That you can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends. So there's a certain investment within certain logics that center on friendship that aren't necessarily there when we think of tethering our devices, right? And so I think that there's all sorts of questions of how these things are discussed and thought of. Maybe?
I have a small question about the temporality of these kinds of events, such as being spammed all of a sudden with Twitter. I mean, it occurs to me that DDoS attack works because everybody's trying to get in at exactly the same time. So I wonder if this recognition of being spammed and that recognition of suddenly knowing everybody who has been spammed is sort of produced in this moment of, I guess, crisis, or this moment of rupture. And I wonder if there's any way to sort of produce that without, like on sort of a different temporal scale, trying to sort of
being that sense of everything, or everything?
Yeah, the sense of care that sort of abruptly happens because all of a sudden, 600 people are reminding you that, guess what, your account has just been hacked. Is there another way of doing that isn't sort of triggered by these sort of abrupt moments?
So those moments of care? Yeah, there are. Well, first of all, I think the distributed denial service stack is slightly different. And I think Ricardo could speak about various ways in which it could be used for political means and things. But I also think that there's two things that happen. And one is the question of, and this is why I've been moving more and more to the notion of new media as habitual. Because what's interesting is the ways in which certain actions linger both voluntarily and involuntarily. And if you think of what Facebook has done in terms of friendship, in terms of news feeds and whatnot, is to take that sort of gesture of action that's necessary for maintaining friendship and automate it in certain ways, right? And if you look at, Tana Booker has written some great articles on how the Facebook algorithm works and how it penalizes people who don't post. Right? If you don't post, then your story won't appear in your friends' thing. So the ways in which it works through a certain logic of capture. But I think that the question of care needs to be far larger than the ways it's being framed here, in terms of touching, right? Because to touch is also to be touched, right? In both good and bad ways. And so I wonder to what extent, if we want to think about care, we need to think about care as being larger than simply these moments of knowing that people or machines are thinking of you. And here, I think that, are you here, the person working on repair shops? Yeah, oh, hi. So I think that the question of repair that's brought up is really interesting as well, and can get you to a different notion of repair and care in different ways. Are there any other questions? Okay, there's lots of cookies and things.